Nathan Brewer had always been meticulous in ways most people would have called obsessive. His apartment, perched on the ninth floor of a worn brick building that leaned slightly into the wind, bore evidence of this quiet precision. Every book aligned with the edge of its shelf, every photograph angled just so, and every surface cleared of the dust that seemed, in other buildings, to settle without protest. Yet even in his ordered life, there existed small fissures that Nathan preferred to ignore. A ceiling tile that sagged slightly above the kitchenette, the persistent hum of the radiator that never quite synchronized with the rhythm of the rest of the building, and the television in the corner of the living room, which, after midnight, seemed to betray a strange kind of agency. It was not new. He had inherited it from the previous tenant, a retired radio engineer who had left behind a collection of wires and fuses, and it had worked without complaint for years. Until 1 month ago, Nathan had noticed that after the clock struck 12, the screen surrendered to a relentless sea of static. No matter how he adjusted the dials, twisted the knobs, or fiddled with the connections at the back, the television refused to display a single coherent image. He had tried unplugging it, replacing the coaxial cable, even consulting a technician who had shrugged and suggested that perhaps it was merely a quirk of old hardware. But Nathan could feel, deep in the marrow of his bones, that something about the way the static pulsed after midnight was deliberate, almost sentient, as if the television itself were breathing behind the veil of white noise. The first night he noticed it, he had sat cross-legged on the faded rug, staring at the wavering gray chaos, listening to the soft hiss that seemed to stretch across the apartment like a thin curtain. The sound was not unpleasant exactly. It was steady, predictable in a way that contrasted with the sudden sharpness of other urban noises. The distant sirens, the low rumble of the subway below, the occasional scrape of a trash bin against the alley wall. But underneath that predictability was a subtle rhythm, a cadence that felt almost like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, out of sync with his own pulse, yet somehow familiar. Nathan had closed his eyes and counted along, attempting to ground himself in reason, telling himself that the static was just electricity, nothing more. And yet, when he opened them, he sometimes thought he caught a flicker in the corner of the screen, a shadow that moved against the flow of the white and black dots. Perhaps it was his imagination. Perhaps the television was merely aging, its circuits fatigued, a tiny betrayal of time. Still, he could not shake the sense that the room had changed. The air felt heavier after midnight, the shadows longer, and the hum of the building itself seemed to lean closer, as if curious. Nathan's routine had shifted around the phenomenon. He found himself finishing meals earlier, washing the dishes before the last light of evening faded from the window, and then positioning himself on the couch well before midnight. He never turned the television on until the clock hands nudged the hour, but as he waited, he often noticed other peculiarities that might have been coincidences. The smell of the radiator seemed sharper after 11:30, metallic and faintly acrid, like iron in water. A single window in the hallway, usually stuck closed by peeling paint, would rattle imperceptibly as though breathing in rhythm with the apartment itself. And sometimes, when he turned his attention to the hallway mirror, He caught glimpses of shapes shifting in the reflection, never fully in focus, always at the edge of perception, vanishing when he tried to look directly at them. He told himself it was the tricks of low light, of fatigue, perhaps even of hunger. Nathan had often skipped late-night snacks, but a tightness had begun to coil in his chest, a tension that persisted long after he had turned the lights off and climbed into bed. The apartment was small, 2 rooms including a kitchenette and bathroom, but Nathan had made it his own with careful attention to detail. He preferred muted colors, gray walls, off-white trim, pale blue curtains that fluttered faintly with each gust that penetrated the double-paned windows. The furniture was functional, sturdy, and well-used. A threadbare armchair sat angled toward the television, worn in a perfect half-circle where his weight had settled over the months. A small writing desk held a laptop and a neat stack of papers, journals filled with sketches and notes, some architectural, some mundane. He had taken to jotting observations about the static, the times it began, the slight variations in the hiss, the rare moments when he thought he saw something in its shifting pattern. He had no idea if it was science, superstition, or simply a creeping strain of madness, but the notes gave him a fragile sense of control. Control, however, was increasingly tenuous. The apartment seemed to tighten around him at night. He felt watched, though the city was alive and bustling beyond the thin walls, the streetlights humming their usual electric lullaby. The shadows of familiar furniture transformed into looming forms after midnight, the couch's armrest resembling a crouched figure, the coat rack a skeletal tree. He would blink and find them inert once more, and yet the impression remained, lingering like the aftertaste of a bitter wine. Outside, the city continued its nocturnal rhythm. Streetlights painted gold puddles across cracked asphalt. Distant horns cut brief swathes of tension through the night, and somewhere far below, the subway groaned through its tunnels. From his window, Nathan could see the fire escape winding down the side of the building, a narrow ladder that had once been a conduit for childhood fantasies of escape and adventure. He sometimes thought about stepping onto it, feeling the cold steel under his fingers, letting the night air carry him downward, far away from the persistent pull of static. But he never did. Instead, he watched as a pair of pigeons roosted atop a nearby ledge, fluffed against the wind, oblivious to the machinery and mechanics of humans below. A neon sign buzzed faintly from across the street, advertising a diner long closed, its glow reflecting off puddles like molten metal. The scene should have been comforting, urban life in its usual mundane beauty, but after midnight it felt fractured, as if the city were a stage and he had been left behind while the actors whispered in a language just beyond hearing. There were small artifacts that disturbed him more than the static itself. One evening, he discovered a faint, wet stain on the carpet near the television, irregular in shape, as though something had leaned there and left its mark. He had cleaned it meticulously, blotting and scrubbing until the fibers returned to their usual muted gray, but the stain would reappear in slightly different locations over the following nights, always near the couch, never further than a few feet from the screen. He tried to rationalize it. A leak from the radiator, condensation from a forgotten glass, a trick of his memory. None of it made sense. The apartment, which he had once known in every crack and shadow, now seemed to shift subtly, imperceptibly, mocking his sense of permanence. He began photographing the corners of the room, comparing them frame by frame, trying to catch whatever he could in the lens, but every photo looked identical to the naked eye. Still, a prickling sensation ran along his spine when he reviewed them, as though some presence hovered just beyond the frame, retreating whenever he attempted to confront it directly. He remembered the first night the television had changed. He had been preparing to watch a documentary, a film about abandoned towns in the American Midwest. The tape had been old, the picture grainy, yet familiar in a way that had offered comfort. Then the clock had slipped past midnight, the room softened into shadows, and the television had transformed. Static filled the screen, more dense than any signal interference he had ever seen. And he had felt it immediately. The room gone colder, the air heavier, the silence deeper than the city noise outside. He tried adjusting the dials, shifting the antenna, even tapping the screen gently with a knuckle, but nothing broke the pattern. It was a solid, living wall of black and white noise, punctuated by a low hiss that seemed to resonate not just in the ears but in the chest, vibrating through bone. Nathan had studied the television for hours, noting small anomalies, a darker blotch that lingered for a heartbeat longer than the rest of the static, the occasional arc of something that looked almost like a figure moving just behind the surface. He had convinced himself it was a trick of perception, nothing more. But the feeling in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. He had tried to distract himself in the early days, reading books, writing, even taking long walks around the neighborhood to tire his mind before midnight. But each attempt ended the same way. The shadows seemed to lengthen in anticipation, the silence stretched taut, and when he returned home, the television's static waited for him like a patient sentinel. He noted that the phenomenon was always precisely timed. Any earlier, and the screen displayed the usual jumble of channels. Any later, and the static had already begun its slow, relentless cycle. The precision unnerved him, as though the television were aware of him, counting the seconds, measuring his attention, and only revealing its secret when the world outside had surrendered to sleep. He had started setting alarms for 11:55, bracing himself with blankets pulled close, a small nightlight thrown across the room to cast a thin halo over the floorboards. Yet the shadows never truly receded. They waited, patient, silent, watching, breathing alongside the hiss. Nathan's life had always been solitary but comfortable, a careful architecture of routine and quiet pleasures. Friends called infrequently, often to discuss work or the banalities of everyday life, and Nathan had begun to recognize a certain comfort in the predictability of such contact. Yet now, after midnight, the apartment felt foreign to him. The walls, familiar in daylight, seemed to lean closer in darkness, their surfaces warping subtly as though breathing with the static itself. Even the furniture betrayed him. The armchair, the couch, the small wooden table all seemed slightly displaced, just enough to unsettle his perception. His notebooks, once neat stacks of observational sketches, began to seem chaotic, their pages filled with scrawled notes, in a hand that appeared shakier than he remembered writing. The ink sometimes smudged inexplicably, as if moisture had risen from the floorboards or the walls themselves. He could not explain it, and yet He could not ignore it. His mind strained to make sense, to anchor itself to rationality. But the apartment resisted, reshaping itself subtly in ways that were only perceptible in moments of stillness, when the static hummed and the air held its breath. Among the oddities, three recurring anomalies seemed to demand particular attention, though Nathan did not yet understand why. First, the radiator's hum, which had always been mundane, now occasionally hissed in a rhythm that mimicked the static itself, a faint echo of the television's pulse that left him uncertain whether the sound came from the machine or the pipes. Second, a single picture frame above the couch, an abstract print of swirling colors he had purchased from a flea market, seemed to flicker when he looked at it from the corner of his eye, its hues shifting imperceptibly, as if the painting were breathing with a hidden life of its own. And third, there was a faint, almost metallic tang to the air near the television, subtle enough to be dismissed as imagination, but persistent enough that Nathan found himself inhaling cautiously, wary of each breath, as though the room contained something he could not yet see. He did not understand the significance of these details, only that they were connected in some imperceptible pattern. Threads weaving toward a revelation he could neither name nor resist. Sleep became increasingly elusive. Nathan would lie in bed with the clock glowing softly across the room, counting the minutes until midnight, listening to the city beyond, and imagining the static waiting for him, patient and sentient. When he closed his eyes, he sometimes dreamed of gray swirls and hissing patterns, landscapes without edges, populated by shifting, indistinct figures that vanished when he blinked. Upon waking, the sensation lingered in his limbs and his thoughts, a residue of the night that the morning could not wash away. Even during the day, when the sun illuminated the apartment in pale, neutral light, he could feel the pull of the television, its unseen currents tugging at the periphery of his consciousness, promising revelations and threats alike. Rational thought, which had once been his refuge, now felt brittle, inadequate against the subtle, creeping dread that insinuated itself into every corner of his awareness. One night, as he prepared for the ritual of watching the static, Nathan paused at the threshold of the living room, noticing something unusual. A faint indentation in the carpet, a shallow groove as though something had shifted across it recently, leaving no other trace. He examined it carefully, pressing a finger into the fibers, but it yielded nothing, giving no further hint of origin or purpose. He remembered the pigeons on the ledge, the neon diner sign, the sagging ceiling tile, everything outside his control, and felt the isolation of his environment deepen. The apartment was a small, suspended world, and the static television was its beating heart, its pulse measured and unyielding. Nathan's mind churned with questions he could not answer, whether the phenomena were products of his imagination, the old wiring of the building, or something else entirely. Something that might be waiting for him to notice, to acknowledge, to engage. As the clock edged toward midnight, Nathan settled into the armchair, pulling a blanket over his knees, and stared at the blank gray canvas of the television. The hum of the radiator synced faintly with the hiss of the screen. The shadows stretched across the walls, reaching tentatively toward him, retreating when he moved. The abstract print above the couch seemed to swirl with greater intensity, as if aware of his gaze. The metallic tang in the air grew slightly more pronounced. His chest tightened, a rhythm matching the pulse of the static. The city beyond continued its indifferent hum, the neon light flickering once, twice, before fading into steady glow. Outside, the wind whispered through the narrow gap in the window, a sound like the sighing of a restless being. Nathan's eyes traced the patterns of the static, trying to discern order, trying to assert dominance over what he could not name. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, as the minute hand nudged past 12, Nathan felt a movement in the room, a subtle shift behind him that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck lift. It was nothing he could identify, no form, no sound beyond the static that pulsed from the television, yet it pressed on his senses with the weight of something watching, something aware. The chill deepened, and the air grew thick, sticky in its silence. Nathan's pulse quickened, not with fear exactly, but with a profound, unsettling awareness. The apartment was no longer entirely his. The television, with its wall of gray static, was no longer merely an object. It had become a presence, patient and precise, and he understood instinctively that this night marked the beginning of a new chapter, a boundary crossed, a threshold from which he could not retreat. Something awaited him within the gray, something that had been waiting for him to notice, for him to surrender his gaze. He leaned forward slightly, caught between the urge to flee and the compulsion to observe, and the room seemed to tilt imperceptibly, a subtle distortion that was almost, but not entirely, visual. Nathan felt the hairs on his arms stand rigid, the fine static in the air pressing against his skin, and the hum of the radiator resonating in his chest like an unspoken chant. Outside, a lone horn echoed in the distance, and the wind rattled the window pane with a sudden, sharp insistence. The city slept, oblivious. Inside, every shadow waited, every whisper of air trembled, and the static waited, a wall of gray that pulsed, alive in a way Nathan could not name, marking the instant before the unknown finally reached beyond the screen. At that moment, as the final hand of the clock settled firmly on midnight, Nathan realized he was no longer simply an observer. The room, the apartment, the television, everything had shifted imperceptibly, yet irreversibly. Something stirred in the gray, something that had been biding its time patiently, silently, and it had finally noticed him. And then the sensation behind him, subtle, nearly imperceptible, tightened, a reminder that he was not alone. The story was only beginning. Nathan Brewer's pulse remained taut, an invisible string stretched between the rigid lines of his ribs as the static on the television pulsed in slow, deliberate waves. His body ached from sitting too long in the armchair, but he dared not move, each muscle locked in tense anticipation. The air around him carried the faint metallic tang he had noticed for nights now, a subtle scent that clung to the back of his throat and made swallowing a conscious act. Beyond the window, the city murmured, but it felt distant, irrelevant. The living room had become a narrow chamber of focus, the furniture and walls closing in, filtered through the gray glow of the screen. He leaned closer, eyes straining against the grainy texture of static, searching for any pattern, any flicker that might betray motion. At first he told himself it was nothing, a trick of shadows, the play of tired neurons, but then a subtle distortion rippled across the surface like a ripple in water frozen mid-air. Nathan's breath caught. The shape was indistinct, a dark smudge against the gray, yet it moved with a kind of deliberateness, pausing, shifting, almost observing. He swallowed, sharp and dry, the sound loud in the quiet room. He imagined a figure lurking, patient, aware, but the rational part of him, the Nathan who had measured every corner of his apartment, catalogued every crack and crevice, recoiled from the suggestion. Yet the mind rarely listened when the body had already begun to tremble. He rose from the chair cautiously, the floorboards creaking underfoot, and circled the room slowly, each step deliberate. The television static seemed to pulse in response to his movement, a low oscillating hum that synchronized with the quickening beat of his heart. He reached the side table and touched the screen lightly, almost as if to feel the texture of the anomaly, but his fingers met only the smooth, cold glass. It resisted intrusion, denying him certainty. In the corner of his vision, he thought he saw something, an elongated shadow retreating just beyond the edge of the armchair. He spun, and nothing was there, only the static, relentless pulsing like a heartbeat not his own. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, slicing through the tension. Nathan jumped, hand pressed to his chest, eyes darting to the wall-mounted receiver. The screen blinked with a message from his sister, Claire. "Everything okay? You haven't answered texts all week?" He hesitated, thumb hovering over the reply, heart still racing. The urge to tell someone, to articulate the absurdity, battled with his instinct to contain it. He typed back a simple yes, deleted it, then sent a cautious "I'm fine," though he knew neither was truthful. The silence that followed, the apartment reclaiming its oppressive stillness, made the static seem louder, more deliberate, a reminder that the momentary intrusion of the outside world could not reach inside. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Nathan paced the small perimeter of the room, restless, counting the seconds until the hum of the radiator synchronized with the static, then unsynchronized, then back again. He touched the walls, the furniture, the edge of the carpet, searching for something tangible, a clue, a reassurance. Each object responded with silence, but the air between them vibrated with anticipation, as if some unspoken presence hovered, unseen yet palpable. Nathan's fingers brushed against the arm of the couch, and he paused, imagining what it would feel like if a hand, not his own, pressed back. He shivered and pulled them away. By morning, the city had resumed its indifferent rhythm. Sunlight filtered weakly through the pale blue curtains, making the static seem less threatening, almost inert. Nathan brewed coffee, the ritual grounding him, the aroma comforting in its familiarity. He glanced at the television as he poured the liquid into a chipped mug. The screen was gray, unremarkable, the disturbance seemingly asleep. Yet he could not convince himself that the episode had ended. Somewhere in the corners of his mind, the image of shifting darkness persisted, a shadow that refused daylight. The next evening, Nathan forced himself to leave the apartment. He walked down cracked sidewalks, past shuttered storefronts, and through the muted hum of urban life, attempting to calibrate his senses, to dilute the static that seemed etched into his perception. At a small cafe, he sat with a cup of tea, the warmth soaking through his palms, his eyes tracing the motions of strangers, noting gestures and expressions as if cataloging proof of normalcy. Across from him, a man and woman argued quietly over the placement of sugar in napkins, and Nathan felt an odd envy, a yearning for mundane squabbles that anchored reality. The static was absent here, or perhaps he was too distracted to perceive it, and that was relief enough to sustain him for the hour he remained. Back at home, however, the tension returned with renewed intensity. He waited until the clock crept toward midnight, the apartment shrinking around him once more. The figure, or what he thought was a figure, appeared again in the gray haze, moving more deliberately this time, lingering at the edges of the screen with a faint sense of recognition. Nathan's hand trembled as he reached forward, pressing lightly against the cold glass. The movement recoiled, subtle, like a whisper against skin. He whispered back internally, pleading for clarity, for rationality, but found neither. The presence was patient, watching, testing his threshold for disbelief. The days blurred into a routine of anticipation and withdrawal. Nathan avoided friends and work calls more deliberately, citing fatigue and a need for solitude. Each night, he approached the television as if crossing a threshold, the static's hum threading through his chest. At one point, he began keeping a journal, noting the variations in the pulse, the obscure flickers, the faint metallic scent that returned with obsessive regularity. These records were imperfect, shaky, yet they were the only markers of continuity he could cling to. His sleep grew fragmented, dreams interwove static with urban landscapes, figures with familiar streets, and the feeling of being watched persisted even in waking hours. Every shadow felt like a hand, every gust of wind a whisper, every creak a deliberate signal. Claire called again, her voice measured, concerned, attempting normality. Nathan described himself in vague terms: fatigue, stress, the general strain of work. She pressed, asking about the apartment, the living situation, subtle probes he deflected. She asked if he wanted her to come by, and he hesitated, torn between the urge for comfort and the fear of sharing something that could not be articulated. He felt his throat tighten, imagining her reaction, imagining her eyes tracking the static, and he said no. He had to face this alone. Her voice, warm and patient, receded into a memory, and the quiet of the apartment returned with oppressive weight. One night, Nathan discovered a new anomaly. While leaning close to the screen, attempting to track the edges of a shadow, he noticed a reflection in the darkened window opposite him. For a split second, it appeared that something indistinct and humanoid mimicked his movements across the room behind him, though he had been alone. He spun around. Nothing. The apartment appeared inert. The window offered only the city beyond, indifferent, glittering. Nathan's heartbeat throbbed in his ears. He traced the reflection back to the television. The static hummed mockingly, as though aware of his recognition. The reflection had vanished. The apartment resumed its ordinary proportions, the room solid and unrevealing, but the sense of observation lingered, persistent and insidious. Nathan moved through the space cautiously, hands grazing surfaces, counting his steps, avoiding the center of the room as if the floor itself might betray him. During a momentary daylight excursion, Nathan spoke with a neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman with bright eyes and a memory for minutiae. She mentioned a strange pattern in the building, objects shifting, noises in the empty hallways, lights flickering even when circuits were intact. Nathan listened, hesitant, Feeling a kinship in their shared experience of subtle disturbances, they exchanged details of anomalies, deliberately vague, neither wishing to name the cause, only acknowledging that the apartment had changed for reasons beyond comprehension. Her words clung to him during the walk home, a whisper of validation that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The sense of being part of a hidden rhythm, a network of perception unnoticed by the city beyond, deepened his obsession. That night, as he prepared for the static's arrival, Nathan tried a new strategy. He positioned a second chair across from his own, facing the television, imagining that having a partner, even an empty one, might stabilize his perception, might anchor the unfolding events to something tangible. The static arrived promptly at midnight, and with it, the shadow. The figure appeared more distinct than before, a darkened mass against the white noise, swaying imperceptibly. Nathan studied it, noted the pattern, recorded the oscillations in his notebook. Yet, when he looked at the second chair, he imagined it filled with presence, a companion to confront the unseen. The apartment seemed to respond, the temperature dropping slightly, the hum deepening. The imagined presence, though absent, added tension to the encounter, a sense of shared observation. And Nathan's skin prickled as though the apartment itself was aware of his ruse. A week later, the midpoint shift occurred. Nathan woke in the middle of the night, not to the alarm of the static, but to a soft scratching sound emanating from the television itself. He rose, muscles tense, and approached cautiously. The screen remained gray, but the sound persisted, rhythmic, deliberate. He pressed a hand to the glass and felt the vibration of something moving behind it. Heart racing, he stepped back and scanned the room. Nothing had changed materially, yet the air was charged differently, heavy with intent. For the first time, he questioned whether the presence was bound to the screen or whether the apartment itself had become an extension of it. Rational thought scrambled to keep pace. He felt as though the laws governing the room, the television, and even his own body were being rewritten incrementally, imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. After that night, Nathan's behavior shifted further. He avoided the middle of the living room, hugging walls and furniture for safety, yet returned nightly to confront the static. He began speaking aloud, rehearsing questions, testing for a response, his voice trembling yet defiant. The shadow became more active, flickering, leaning toward motion rather than merely mimicking. Nathan's interior monologue intensified, the stakes he had once measured in fear now quantified in uncertainty, each heartbeat marking the possibility of escalation. He documented the changes meticulously, creating charts of pulse, flicker, and duration, tracing every nuance, every microsecond of irregularity. Sleep became impossible. Dreams interwove with reality, each movement of his limbs accompanied by imagined echoes in the gray. Claire visited finally, sensing that his messages contained more subtext than content. She arrived at dusk, hesitant, holding a bag of groceries and a stack of freshly laundered linens. Nathan guided her through the apartment, noting the small anomalies, though he avoided dramatizing them. As he spoke, the shadows stretched and twitched, responding perhaps to the tension in the air, perhaps to his own heightened perception. She asked questions, probing gently, and he explained in fragments, careful not to impose his fear. Her presence was grounding, but it also drew attention to the distortions, the faint hum of the radiator, the metallic tang in the air, the unnatural pause in the flicker of the static when she entered. Nathan noticed the subtle shift in the shadow. It seemed to hesitate, then retreat slightly into the gray. In conversation, she suggested that he see someone professionally, a psychologist, or perhaps a technician for the television. Nathan agreed in theory, but felt the suggestion inadequate. He could not articulate that this was more than circuitry or neurosis. The static was deliberate. The shadow was deliberate. The apartment had become a space of anticipation, a theater for the patient and persistent. He asked her to stay the night, fearing the isolation, and she acquiesced. Her presence did not dispel the tension, but added a new layer. He was now accountable, not just to himself, but to someone who might witness the phenomena. That night, the static arrived punctually, but the shadow acted differently, lingering near the screen's edge as though aware of Claire's gaze. Nathan noticed every movement, every pause, the fine oscillation of gray and black, cataloging and measuring, feeling the delicate edge of sanity slip further from his grasp. The following scene unfolded with a subtle escalation. Nathan attempted to manipulate the screen, covering half of it with a sheet of paper to isolate the shadow's movement. The figure responded, leaning toward the uncovered portion, stretching its form as though it could perceive the obstruction. Nathan's pulse raced, and he felt the room shift slightly beneath his feet, imperceptibly but undeniably. He spoke softly, questioning, reasoning, trying to coax clarity. The apartment remained unresponsive, yet the static pulsed in kind with his speech, the shadow synchronizing in ways that suggested awareness, intent. He recorded everything in the notebook, tracing connections, noting minutiae that might otherwise appear inconsequential, aware that the boundary between observation and obsession had narrowed dangerously. Over the next nights, Nathan experimented further, moving furniture slightly, adjusting lighting, even attempting to cross the threshold to stand directly in front of the screen. Each action provoked subtle responses, shadows extending, the hum modulating, the metallic tang intensifying. He noted these changes, the internal stakes rising with each iteration. Sleep was negligible. The boundary between dream and waking blurred. The apartment, once a refuge, had become an arena, and always the static waited, patient, deliberate, an entity neither fully tangible nor entirely imagined. A confrontation with Claire occurred unexpectedly. She had remained silent during one of the nights, watching Nathan's obsessive cataloging, until she asked him whether he had considered leaving, whether his fixation on the static was consuming him. Nathan's response was measured, though tense. He explained the patterns, the presence, the precise timing. Her skepticism was gentle but firm, questioning the interpretation, urging rationality, cautioning against the assumption of intent in inanimate objects. Nathan listened, absorbing her perspective, yet found it insufficient. The shadow on the screen responded subtly, flickering more aggressively at her doubt, its edges sharpening, suggesting that the phenomena were adapting, learning, responding to their observer's cognition. Nathan's anxiety spiked, a visceral reminder that the stakes were no longer internal only. He feared that whatever presence occupied the gray might extend beyond his comprehension, beyond the television itself. In subsequent nights, Nathan experimented with ignoring the static entirely, leaving the room, walking the apartment, attempting mundane tasks like cleaning dishes, adjusting bookshelves, or staring out the window at the indifferent city. Each absence was measured in minutes before he felt a pull, a sensation of incomplete perception, as though the room demanded his focus. Returning to the armchair, he observed the static and the shadow, noting subtle differences, minuscule movements, changes in hue and vibration. The more he ignored it, the more pronounced the activity became, suggesting a feedback loop of attention and response, anticipation and observation. An unexpected auditory anomaly developed. Faint breathing, almost imperceptible, accompanied the static. Nathan paused, listening intently, straining to separate reality from imagination. The sound was shallow, rhythmically uneven, sometimes matching his own inhalations, sometimes diverging entirely. He traced its origin: floorboards, walls, radiator, but the apartment offered no confirmation. Claire, awakened by subtle disturbances, questioned it gently, attributing it to wind, old pipes, or city noise. Nathan wanted to argue, to assert the unnatural, but he did not. Instead, he catalogued, measured, waited. The breathing persisted, growing marginally louder, a pulse synchronized with but not entirely bound to the static. Nathan's journals filled with intricate patterns, diagrams of movement, charts of intensity, and annotations describing tactile sensations, cold patches on the floor, a shift in air pressure near the screen, the metallic scent intensifying. He began noticing physiological responses, a tightening of the throat, the subtle quiver in his eyelids, a fine sweat forming at the temples. Each observation reinforced the mounting internal stakes. He recognized obsession taking root, yet he could not withdraw. The apartment demanded participation, and the static required his unwavering attention. One night, a storm passed overhead, wind rattled in the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the gray static in stark bursts. Nathan's focus sharpened. The shadow responded differently, elongating with the flicker of natural light, stretching across the screen in ways impossible in normal perception. Claire, uneasy, suggested turning off the television, leaving the apartment. Nathan refused. The stakes were no longer just understanding but confrontation. Observation had become imperative. The storm passed, but its residue lingered. The shadows lingered, the static pulsed, the subtle breathing persisted. Nathan felt the weight of the coming confrontation pressing toward him, inevitable, irrevocable. The midpoint twist had resolved. What had been subtle, seemingly innocuous, now possessed a tangible rhythm and awareness that demanded attention, testing the limits of his perception, sanity, and courage. Over the following nights, Nathan's experiments became more elaborate. He placed objects near the screen, books, a glass of water, a small potted plant, to gauge reaction. Each provoked nuanced responses, ripples across the gray, distortions in shape, faint shifts in shadow that suggested awareness beyond mere electronics. The apartment's temperature oscillated minutely, and the metallic scent waxed and waned with uncanny precision. He began speaking aloud, narrating his actions, seeking patterns in the response, recording every nuance. The lines between observation, participation, and provocation blurred, each feeding the other, and Nathan's internal tension deepened. Every night, he anticipated the moment when the shadow would transition from observation to interaction. By the final scene before the climax, The room had transformed into a theater of anticipation. Nathan, seated in his armchair, notebook in lap. Claire perched on the edge of the couch, both fixated on the static, observed every tremor, every flicker, every subtle change. The shadow moved again, deliberate, oscillating between the periphery and center of the gray field. The faint breathing persisted, stronger now, as though asserting presence. Nathan's pulse hammered, each inhalation echoing the rhythm of the phenomenon. Claire's hand rested lightly on his arm, grounding yet insufficient. The tension coiled tighter than ever, and he sensed that whatever had been waiting in the gray for months was poised on the threshold of emergence. His eyes traced the screen, the edge of the shadow, the subtle cues, anticipating the inevitable escalation. The room held its breath in unison, the city beyond indifferent. The storm passed, but its echoes still vibrating through walls and floorboards. Nathan's focus was absolute, his body taut, and every instinct screamed that the next movement would not be confined to the screen. Everything had led here. The unknown was ready to cross the boundary. Nathan Brewer sat on the edge of his bed, the room bathed in pale morning light that filtered through the blinds in thin geometric stripes. The air smelled faintly of burned coffee and ozone, residual from the night storm, and his limbs felt heavy, still trembling with the adrenaline that had refused him sleep. The television, once a harbinger of restless dread, stood silent in the corner, a blank canvas now as if it had never pulsed with static, never housed the dark, patient shadow that had haunted him for weeks. Nathan flexed his fingers, feeling the rough, papery texture of his notebook against his palms. The pages filled with minute observations, sketches, and trembling annotations. Everything was still, yet the echo of what had transpired lingered in the room, subtle and persistent. Claire, seated cross-legged on the couch, traced the rim of her mug absent-mindedly, her gaze distant. Nathan noticed the way the light caught in her hair, illuminating strands he had never seen in daylight before, giving her a fragile halo of warmth. She looked up, startled slightly by his glance, and smiled, a soft, quiet gesture that carried the weight of both relief and exhaustion. She didn't speak immediately, allowing the quiet to settle, to let the world outside the apartment ease back into a rhythm that had been disrupted by nights of tension and uncertainty. Nathan finally broke the silence. He admitted, softly, almost to himself, that he could feel the absence of the shadow. It was gone, or at least receded far enough that the air no longer carried its oppressive weight. He wondered if he had imagined its final movement, the slight tilt in the gray, the lingering pulse beneath the static that had always seemed so deliberate. Claire's voice followed, gentle and grounding. She suggested that perhaps what had haunted him was never fully tangible, that sometimes fear and attention could create shapes in empty space. Nathan considered this, the words settling into his chest like a balm, but he also knew that their experience had been real in a way that was impossible to quantify. His fingers tightened around the notebook, seeking the textures that confirmed his reality. They spoke next of the storm that had rattled the windows the night the shadow had been at its most active. Nathan recalled the moment when the air had shifted, charged with tension, when the shadow had stretched toward the light, flickering from the lightning. Claire murmured that she had felt it too, the anticipation in the room, the waiting, She said she had never felt anything like it, a presence that existed without form but demanded acknowledgement. Nathan nodded, recalling the metallic tang in the air, the subtle vibrations that threaded through the floorboards and walls, an unspoken signal that something that had neither flesh nor name, had been observing, testing, waiting. He confessed that he had feared he would never feel the ordinary again, that the apartment itself might have been claimed, and Claire reached across the small distance between them, hand resting lightly against his arm, grounding him in the ordinary and the shared. Later, they went to the kitchen together, preparing breakfast in quiet collaboration. The clatter of dishes, the aroma of fried eggs, and the warmth of the stove created a fragile cocoon of normalcy. Nathan listened to Claire hum softly while she cracked an egg, a sound that seemed impossibly human after the tension of the past weeks. He smiled, hesitant but real, and asked her almost teasingly whether she had ever imagined him in a state of panic over a television. She laughed, a light, unguarded sound that filled the apartment with an air of possibility. Nathan's reply was quiet, admitting that he hadn't either, and they both fell into a rhythm of shared domesticity, a simple counterpoint to the nights of shadowed anticipation. The days passed, and Nathan discovered that the static did not return. The apartment no longer felt hostile. The edges of the walls no longer seemed to stretch or lean. Even the radiator's hum, once ominous in its occasional mimicry of the television, was ordinary again. The metallic tang dissipated, leaving air scented only with faint warmth and lingering hints of coffee. Nathan began small rituals, testing the normalcy cautiously, opening cabinets, running water, touching the arm of the couch. Each act confirmed absence, and each confirmation brought relief, tempered by lingering wariness. He still recorded observations, though the notes became mundane. Measurements of room temperature, subtle light shifts, but the obsessive strain had eased. The apartment had reclaimed itself, or perhaps he had reclaimed perception, the delineation now unnecessary to probe further. One evening, Claire suggested a walk along the river, a deliberate intrusion of outside life into their reclaimed apartment. Nathan agreed, leaving the television unplugged for the first time in weeks. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant exhaust. Streetlights reflected off puddles, creating fractured patterns on the sidewalk that Nathan found comforting rather than menacing. Claire spoke softly about returning to work, about routines, about the subtle joys that gone unnoticed while fear dominated attention. Nathan listened, noticing the lift of her brows, the cadence of her voice, and he allowed himself to imagine a future untethered from shadows. The walk stretched for hours, the city's nocturnal hum now a lullaby rather than a threat. Back in the apartment, they reintroduced themselves to light. Nathan opened all blinds, letting sunlight spill across the floorboards and furniture. Claire suggested painting the walls, not to erase memory, but to mark a new chapter. Nathan agreed, considering pale, warm hues that could absorb light differently, shift perception subtly. The act was symbolic as much as practical. Together, they moved furniture, cleared corners, tested the air, and listened for echoes that no longer existed. Their cooperation in mundane tasks became a healing rhythm, replacing the obsessive cataloging of fear with deliberate cultivation of space and life. During one afternoon, while Nathan sorted the notebooks, Claire noticed a small note tucked between pages he hadn't seen for weeks. She read it aloud softly, a simple reflection, almost a prayer noting fear, curiosity, and the longing for understanding. Nathan admitted he hadn't remembered writing it, and they shared a quiet laugh at the strangeness of memory, at the passage of time and perspective. The episode of fear that had once dominated the apartment now existed only in the margins of consciousness, an echo that informed but no longer dictated life. They placed the notebooks on a shelf together, organized not out of obsession, but out of preservation. One evening, the television, still unplugged, seemed to beckon from its corner. Nathan approached cautiously, hand hovering above the buttons, memories of static and shadow pressing in. He pressed power. The screen remained dark, inert. He traced a finger across the glass, feeling only cold smoothness. Claire watched, leaning lightly against the doorframe, smiling gently. Nathan exhaled, and the tension dissolved, replaced by the fragile, deliberate peace of choice. The apparatus of fear remained, but without power it was a relic, inert, subject to human will. They sat together on the couch, holding mugs of tea, the soft hum of city life outside blending with their quiet breathing. Nathan admitted aloud, carefully, that he still felt traces of doubt, moments when the memory of the shadow surfaced in peripheral vision, when the metallic tang seemed to linger. Claire acknowledged it with tenderness, suggesting that memory and imagination were partners in the human experience, that vigilance need not dictate existence. Nathan nodded, feeling the wisdom in her voice, the groundedness in her presence, and allowed himself to believe that the apartment, the television, and even the shadow existed now as something manageable, something that could be acknowledged without fear. They spoke of plans, small, deliberate steps forward, painting the walls, repairing the radiator, introducing fresh plants to shift the atmosphere. Nathan laughed quietly at the idea of tracking temperature variations in houseplants, and Claire nudged him, smiling, noting that some observations could be joyous rather than obsessive. They moved with ease through the apartment, marking the space with light, air, and care. The shadows no longer intimidated, the static remained silent, and Nathan's journal entries became records of restoration, not anxiety. Life began to flow in deliberate, gentle increments, the apartment reclaimed through attention not born of fear, but of presence. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. Nathan opened it to find Mrs. Callahan, the elderly neighbor, holding a small basket of baked goods. She asked, with gentle curiosity, if they had been managing okay, if the apartment had returned to normal. Nathan exchanged a glance with Claire, and together they admitted that it had. Mrs. Callahan smiled, offering encouragement and quiet congratulations. She lingered briefly, sharing anecdotes about the building's history, about the peculiarities of older apartments, and the resilience of those who lived within them. When she left, the apartment felt lighter, infused with a sense of community and continuity that had been absent during the weeks of isolation. Nathan realized that even small human connection could anchor perception, a lesson sharper than any notebook could capture. Over the following days, Nathan and Claire continued small rituals, cooking together, reading aloud, walking the neighborhood. Each act of normalcy reinforced the fragile sense of stability. Occasionally, Nathan glanced at the television, remembering the nights of static, the shadow, the metallic tang, the subtle breathing. Yet now these recollections carried a different weight, not terror, but understanding of limits, of endurance, of resilience. He told Claire that he felt more in control, not because he had banished the unknown, but because he had learned to coexist with the memory of it, to inhabit the apartment fully despite its past anomalies. One evening, as twilight bled into the apartment, Nathan placed a small potted plant on the windowsill. The leaves caught the last light of the day, casting dancing shadows across the wall. Claire observed, commenting that even shadows could be beautiful when framed by choice and light. Nathan nodded, touching the leaves lightly, sensing the subtle texture, the life contained within. He realized finally that the apartment, the television, and even the echo of the shadow had taught him something essential. Attention could create fear, but it could also cultivate care. Observation could imprison, but it could also liberate. He felt a warmth in his chest, not naive or untested, but earned, deliberate, human. In the final hours of the evening, they sat side by side on the couch, the city humming softly beyond the walls. Nathan sipped tea, eyes tracing the light fading from the windows. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt the simple, profound reality of presence, of shared experience, of life reclaimed from the edge of fear. He glanced at the television one last time, noting its inert surface, imagining the static and the shadow as memories now safely archived in his mind. He whispered to Claire that he thought it had been a teacher in its own cryptic way, and she smiled, replying that some lessons were hardest when unspoken. The night deepened, but Nathan's chest felt light. The apartment was quiet, yet not oppressive. The air carried the faint scent of tea and the soft warmth of radiators, and in the silence, Nathan recognized an enduring truth. The unknown could be acknowledged, examined, and lived alongside without domination. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the city and his own heartbeat, sensing the rhythm of life resuming, fragile and vivid. As the clock ticked past midnight, Nathan did not reach for the television. Instead, he felt a subtle satisfaction in the constancy of choice, in the reclaiming of the apartment, in the presence of Claire beside him. The shadow, the static, the tension, they existed now only as echoes, and echoes could teach without tormenting. He breathed deeply, savoring the normalcy of air, light, and companionship. A single leaf of the plant shivered against the window pane, and Nathan smiled at the small miracle, the gentle persistence of life in all its ordinary luminous complexity. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, indifferent yet alive, and Nathan felt finally that he was too.